settle in and let your breathing slow, because tonight you are stepping onto a place that feels too high for ordinary thoughts. The Tibetan Plateau is not a mountaintop view. It is a whole world lifted upward, wide and quiet, where the light looks cleaner and distances play little tricks on your eyes. You might think you are standing on solid, permanent ground, but you are really resting on a slow, geological decision. Two pieces of earth still pressing together, still raising the land in motions too patient to notice. With the Sleepless Geographer, you will drift across thin air, shy river beginnings, salt lakes with no exit, and the calm, stubborn life that keeps going anyway. You take a few steps, and the first thing you notice is not what you see, it is what you do not see. No tall trees reaching for attention. No thick forests to muffle the world. Just a wide, open sweep of land that behaves like an ocean made of grass and stone. This height changes everything. The air is thinner, and it does not hold warmth like it should. Sunlight arrives sharp and direct, like a spotlight with no diffuser. And when a cloud slides in front of the sun, the temperature can drop fast enough to feel personal. You think the horizon is close. It is not. The plateau is a master of mild deception. The clean light steals away haze, and your eyes lose the usual depth cues. A ridge that looks like a casual stroll can take hours, and you will still be walking toward it, like you are chasing a thought that keeps backing away. Under your feet, the ground is not dramatic, but it is honest. Dry turf, tight little clumps of grass, hardy shrubs that keep themselves low. They do not waste energy on height, because up here, height is a bad investment. The wind will take it. The cold will punish it. The sun will bleach it. So life stays close to the ground where a few degrees of warmth can hide. And you begin to notice small signs that would feel trivial anywhere else. A faint path pressed into the soil, the kind made by hooves that know where to go. Yak trails, patient and repeating, stitched across the land like quiet handwriting. You see stones stacked in a simple pile, maybe a marker, maybe a memory. In a place this open, even a small human gesture looks brave, or stubborn, or both. A lone stream threads through a shallow depression. It does not roar. It does not announce itself. It makes a soft sound, like fabric shifting. The water is clear because it has not had time to learn how to be dirty. You walk alongside it for a while, and you start to feel the scale of what you are standing on. This is not a valley floor. This is not a mountain pass. This is a plateau so large that it has its own moods, its own weather, its own sense of distance. It is called the roof of the world, which makes it sound like a single peak. But you are not perched on a point. You are on a table, a huge high table raised thousands of years before your first breath, and still being lifted now. And once your eyes adjust to the openness, you start to notice the land is not flat at all. It is gently lifted, like a slow wave frozen in place. The wave is not made of water. It is made of rock and time and pressure that never gets tired. You can feel it in the way the ground rolls. Not steep hills, not dramatic cliffs, just long, patient rises and long, patient falls. You think of plateaus as calm features, like the earth took a break, but this one is the opposite. This plateau is what happens when the planet refuses to stop working. Long ago, a piece of the world that is now India drifted northward, not quickly, not dramatically, more like a slow shopping cart in a parking lot, rolling toward another cart that is pretending not to notice, except these carts are continents, and the collision takes millions of years. When the leading edge finally meets Asia, the rock does not politely step aside. It crumbles, it thickens, it piles up. It is not a clean break, not a neat crack. It is pressure turning the crust into something like dented metal. This is mountain building, which sounds inspiring until you remember what it really means. It means grinding. It means stone being forced to behave like dough. The Himalayas are the famous result, the dramatic teeth along the southern edge. But you are not focused on the teeth tonight. You are on the jaw behind them, the broad, lifted mass, the quiet consequence. The Tibetan Plateau rose over an unimaginable stretch of time. It did not pop up like a stage prop. It kept lifting and spreading and adjusting while entire species came and went like brief ideas. Even now, the land is still changing. The collision has not finished its sentence. The crust is still being squeezed and thickened deep down where you cannot see. Faults slowly store strain like a coiled spring, and sometimes the strain releases in a sudden, unforgiving correction. Congratulations, you are sleeping on a place that is still under construction. But most nights, it does not feel violent. Most nights, it feels like stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from scale. When a place is this big, its movements are either too slow to notice or too sudden to predict. You walk again, and the wind brushes over the ground in a way that makes the grass ripple. It looks like water from far away, and you could almost believe it. But step closer, and you see the grass is stiff, close-cropped, and tough. Each blade is a small act of endurance. The shrubs are sparse and shaped by weather like they have been sanded down. They grow where they can, in small dips that catch moisture, in leeward spots behind stones, in places where snow lingers just a little longer. And if you pause long enough, you hear the plateau's main soundtrack: wind moving over stone, wind slipping through grass, wind finding every seam in your clothing as if it is checking your work. Sometimes the wind carries dust, fine and pale. It gets into your mouth and tastes like mineral and distance. The plateau makes you aware that your body is a temporary visitor. The land does not react to you. It does not care that you are impressed. You look up, and the sky feels larger than it should. That is partly because there is so little vertical clutter. No tall trees, few buildings, just the land and the dome above it, clean and open. Clouds appear, and you can watch them cast shadows that slide over the ground. The shadows move like slow, dark lakes, drifting across hills you did not notice until the light reveals them. This is where a plateau starts to become more than geology. It becomes atmosphere. It becomes weather, and not the normal kind. And when land rises this high, it does not just change the view. It changes the air, the clouds, and the way weather behaves across half a world. You are standing on something that acts like a giant heat and cold machine. In summer, the high surface can warm under the sun, and that warmth pulls air upward. When air rises, It creates space for other air to rush in. And that is the beginning of big weather patterns. The plateau is like a broad, elevated hand, nudging winds into new paths. It helps steer storms. It encourages some clouds to build, and it discourages others. It shapes the monsoon like a stone shapes a river current. The monsoon itself is not a single thing. It is a seasonal rhythm, a shift in winds driven by temperature contrasts between land and ocean. Warm land pulls in moist air. Cool land lets dry air dominate. And the Tibetan Plateau, sitting high and wide, makes those contrasts sharper. In summer, moisture can be drawn inland, not evenly, not politely. Some regions get clouds that pile up and finally give in. Other regions sit under a hard blue sky, watching the rain fall somewhere else. In winter, the plateau often feels dry and clear. Cold air settles. The sky can turn a deep, clean blue that looks almost painted. The sun is bright, but it does not necessarily help. It can shine on you while the air stays cold, like a light that does not come with heat. You watch clouds form quickly, especially near the edges and over ridges. A puff becomes a smear becomes a slow caravan. Then the wind changes, and the clouds thin out and vanish as if they changed their mind. This is not rare here. The plateau teaches weather new rules. It gives the atmosphere a raised stage, and the performance becomes unpredictable in small ways. On calm days, the silence feels enormous. It is not the absence of sound, it is the absence of human sound. No engines, no distant highways, just wind, and the occasional call of a bird that seems to hang in the air longer than it should. You notice how sound travels differently. In thin air, some things feel muted, yet other sounds carry surprisingly far across open ground. A stone kicked ahead of you makes a crisp tick, then a soft scrape. It is a small sound, but in this space, it matters. And in this place, moisture is always making choices. And when the air plays these games with moisture and cold, the water that does arrive has to decide: freeze, seep, or begin a long downhill journey. You follow the shallow stream again, and you start to understand the plateau as a birthplace, not of cities, not of empires, but of water routes that feed continents. Some of Asia's great rivers begin here. Names you have heard in other contexts, tied to crowded cities and wide deltas. But up here, at the start, they do not look important at all. A great river can begin as a shy trickle, a patch of wet ground, a spring that barely admits it exists, snowmelt seeping out from under a lingering drift, forming threads that braid together, then separate again. The headwaters move in slow motion. Water gathers patiently, with no audience. It is not a dramatic source, not a single heroic waterfall. It is a quiet agreement between gravity and terrain. Snow falls in cold seasons, and some of it stays. Ice and snow can hold water for months, sometimes years, releasing it slowly when the sun returns. In warmer moments, the surface melts and water slips into the soil. In colder moments, it locks up again, stiffening the ground. Permafrost can exist in patches here, ground that stays frozen beneath the surface for long stretches. It acts like a lid, changing how water moves. Instead of sinking deep, water spreads shallowly, feeding marshes and wet meadows that look oddly soft in such a harsh place. You step carefully near one of these wet areas. The ground has a spongy, the grasses are thicker, the air smells faintly sweet and earthy, which feels strange at this altitude, like finding a familiar scent in an unfamiliar room. This is where rivers hesitate. They do not know what they are yet. They wander, they split, and rejoin. They make little loops, then abandon them. They test the land for weaknesses, looking for the easiest path down. And the land, for its part, is gently tilted, not enough to see as a slope, but enough that water can feel it. Water always feels it. Water is annoyingly good at its job. You watch a thin channel cut through mud. The sides are smooth, the cut fresh. This is erosion in its baby form. Not the spectacular canyon kind, just water patiently pulling grains away, one after another, like someone unthreading a sweater. Far away, millions of people depend on these first choices. They depend on snow that fell on a quiet ridge, on meltwater that slipped out on a sunny afternoon, on a marsh that stored water like a sponge, then released it later when everything else dried out. Downstream, those rivers become infrastructure. They become borders. They become arguments. They become lifelines. Up here, they are just water trying to become itself. You keep walking, and the stream you followed begins to slow. It spreads out, as if it is getting tired. The channel becomes shallow and wide. The water grows still in places, then moves again, and you realize that not all water here gets to leave. Follow that water a little longer, and you will find it pooling in places that look like oceans of blue, except they do not have anywhere to go. A lake appears in the distance, bright as a shard of sky dropped onto the earth. It does not sparkle like the sea. It gleams with a harder light because the air is thin and the sun is direct. As you approach, the shoreline is not sandy in the usual way. It can be crusty, pale, and rough. In some places, it crunches under your steps. Salt, mineral, the leftovers of water that arrived and then vanished into the sky. Many plateau lakes are closed bowls. Water flows in from small rivers and seasonal melt, but there is no outlet river carrying it onward. It sits, it spreads, it waits, and the only way out is up. Evaporation, the slow lifting of water molecules into dry air. The lake becomes a kind of ledger. Every year, water brings in tiny bits of dissolved rock, minerals from the surrounding land, carried in invisibly. When the water evaporates, those minerals stay behind. Over long time, the concentration rises. Some lakes become salty enough to taste harsh and metallic. Not a refreshing seaside salt, more like licking a stone that has been sweating in the sun. The colors can look unreal. Turquoise, deep blue, milky green. Color depends on depth, on sediment, on microscopic life, and on dissolved minerals. The lake is chemistry wearing a costume. On windless days, the surface becomes a mirror. The reflection is so clean, it feels like the sky has doubled, and you are standing between two infinities. For a moment, it is hard to tell which way is up and which way is down. But then a breeze arrives, and the mirror breaks into small shivers of light. Little waves run across the surface, and the lake becomes itself again. Water, restless, never fully satisfied. The shoreline shows you rings, pale lines marking former water levels, like bathtub rings left by seasons. In wetter periods, the lake expands. In drier periods, it retreats, leaving behind fresh salt flats that glare white under the sun. You walk along one of these flats, and it feels like walking on a dry memory. The ground is firm in places, but can turn soft without warning. Salt crust over mud, pretending to be stable. Congratulations! You have discovered a landscape that looks solid and sometimes is not. The plateau is full of these quiet traps. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just small reminders that water and ground are always negotiating. And because these lakes do not drain, they are sensitive. A slight change in temperature, in precipitation, in meltwater timing can shift their size. They can grow, swallowing grazing land, or shrink, exposing more salt and dust to the wind. In recent decades, some areas of the plateau have seen lakes expand, linked to changing patterns of melt and rainfall. It is not a simple story, because nothing up here is simple. But the lake's record changed the way tree rings do, except there are no trees, so the water has to do the remembering. You stand at the edge and listen. There is not much sound. A faint lap at the shore, wind moving across the surface, maybe the distant call of a bird that knows this is a place worth visiting. Birds do come, sometimes in surprising numbers. These lakes can be resting places along migration routes, bright targets in a vast high land. Life takes what it can get. And when you look past the lake, past its bright stillness, you begin to notice something else. In the far distance, the land stops being gentle. The plateau does not stay high forever. At its edges, it makes a decision. And when you look past the lakes, you notice the edges of the plateau where the land finally decides to fall away. Sometimes, all at once. Out there, the horizon starts to sharpen into a line of teeth, not because the land gets angry, but because gravity finally gets leverage. You walk toward that distant edge, and the air stays thin, almost dry enough to squeak. The ground under you remains patient for a while. Rolling hills, soft swells of turf, scattered stones that look casually dropped. Then the surface begins to tense. The little undulations become longer slopes. The drainage lines stop meandering and start choosing sides. You thought the plateau was the main event. Wrong. The plateau is the long inhale. The edge is the exhale. The first real sign is how water behaves. Up on the high interior, streams can dawdle. Near the margins, water gets serious. Channels deepen, banks harden, and the land starts to crease like fabric pulled tight across a knee. You come to a vantage where the earth simply falls away. Not in a neat cliff, not in one dramatic step, but in a chain of drops. Ridges stack beyond ridges. Valleys fold into valleys. Shadows collect in deep places where sunlight arrives late and leaves early. This is where the Tibetan Plateau stops being a wide table and becomes a wall. And the wall has famous name recognition: the Himalayas, the poster range, the mountains that show up on every map like an overconfident signature. But standing here, you do not feel like you are looking at a postcard. You feel like you are looking at a collision that never resolved its argument. A slow motion shove between India and Asia, still pushing, still thickening the crust, still lifting and fracturing the surface. The strange thing is how quickly worlds change over short distances. One moment you are in open, treeless space. The next, you are peering into a valley that hides its own weather. Down there, air can pool. Warmth can linger. You can have conifers and broadleaf trees far below you, while you stand in grass and rock and thin wind. It is like leaning over a balcony and seeing a different season stored in the shadows. You start descending, and your ears notice the pressure first. The air gains weight, just a little. Sounds begin to travel differently. Wind becomes less of a constant presence and more of a moving thing, arriving in gusts that funnel through terrain, because that is what mountains do. They do not just rise, they redirect. A pass is not just a low point in a ridge, it is a nozzle. It squeezes air, it accelerates wind, it takes weather systems and rearranges them like furniture in the dark. You learn this when the breeze becomes a steady push at your shoulder, as if the range is gently hurting you. Your clothes snap, dust lifts off gravel, a few dry stalks bend low and stay there, resigned. And the slopes around you do not look stable. They look like they are holding themselves together out of habit. The rock faces show long scars, pale stripes where something slid recently. Talus fans spread at the base of cliffs, piles of broken stone that crunch underfoot like ceramic shards. Gravity has been shopping here for a long time, and it never leaves empty-handed. Congratulations! You have arrived at the part of the world that is actively trying to become lower. You keep going, and the valleys deepen. Some are wide U-shapes, smoothed and broadened by ancient ice. Others are sharp V-shapes, cut by water that had nowhere else to put its energy. Sometimes you can see both, layered like handwriting from different eras, glacial geometry overwritten by river incision. And when you look closely, you notice that the mountains are not one uniform material. Bands of different rocks show through, folded and tilted. Sedimentary layers that were once horizontal seabed are now standing at angles, like books shoved on a shelf by an impatient hand. That is not metaphor. Some of this rock truly was seabed. Long before the Himalayas were a concept, there was an ocean here, a wide, warm body of water between the approaching Indian landmass and Asia. As India moved north, that ocean crust was forced down, consumed, and crumpled. The sea disappeared, but its leftovers got lifted into the sky. It is a strange comfort in a grim way. Even mountains are recycling. As you descend, you feel the scale of the barrier. The Himalayas are not just tall. They are long and thick and layered. Their job is not beauty. Their job is to intercept. They intercept moisture coming from the south. They force air to rise. And when air rises, it cools. And when it cools, it drops water. That is why the southern slopes can be drenched, green, and noisy with rivers, while the interior behind the wall can stay dry, bright, and spare. This is called a rain shadow, which sounds gentle, like a soft umbrella effect. But it can redraw ecosystems. It can decide where forests exist and where deserts begin. It is a shadow that can stretch for hundreds of miles, and it does not care about your plans. You walk along a ridge, and the view is two different stories at once. One side opens toward the plateau, broad and high, multicolored in tans and grays and cold blues. The other side drops into a maze of valleys, some hazed with moisture, some sharply clear, all of them carved deeper than they seem possible. And you start to feel that the edge of the plateau is not a line. It is a zone, a complicated seam. In some places, the seam is abrupt, an escarpment, a steep front where rock layers step down like a broken staircase. In other places, it is a gradual tipping, a transition from high plains into broken foothills, then into ridges that keep rising until you forget where the plateau ended. It depends on faults, on rock type, on how rivers found their paths, on where ice did its slow sculpting, on where the crust chose to crack. Because when continents collide, they do not just lift, they break. Faults run through these ranges like old stitches. Some are thrust faults, where one slab rides up over another, pushed by relentless compression. Others are strike-slip faults, where blocks slide sideways past each other, like two heavy books scraping on a table. Most of the time, you will not notice. The movement is measured in inches per year, the pace of fingernails and patient grudges. But the mountains store that motion as stress, and every so often, the stress releases. A quake here does not feel like a simple shake. It feels like the ground briefly forgetting its job. Slopes can fail. Rock can fall. Whole sections of a valley wall can loosen and become a moving cloud of debris, racing downhill faster than your body is built to accept. And then, silence again. The land returns to its long, quiet labor, pretending it did nothing. You keep descending, and you pass through small pockets of human life that look carefully placed, a cluster of buildings in a sheltered fold, a line of prayer flags, sun-bleached and fraying, strung where wind will keep them in motion. People do not conquer terrain like this. They negotiate with it. They find places that are less bad. They build low. They plan around winter. They learn which slopes shed rocks, which gullies flood, which passes close under snow. The road, if there is one, is rarely straight. It clings to contours. It avoids the worst grades. It sidesteps unstable slopes with the caution of someone walking past a sleeping animal. And then you reach a river that is no longer shy. Up on the plateau, it was threads and marsh. Here, it is a muscle, cold, fast, loud enough to fill the valley with sound. It carries silt, grit, and stones that click together underwater. The color can be glacial milk, pale and opaque, because the river is full of finely ground rock. That fine rock powder has a name: glacial flour. It sounds quaint, like something you bake bread with. It is actually stone that has been crushed by ice into dust, then delivered downstream in a steady, chalky rush. You follow the river, and you begin to understand the valleys as corridors. Not easy corridors, but inevitable ones. Water takes the lowest route. Humans, when they can, follow water. So these valleys become paths, trade routes, migration lanes, and sometimes boundaries that decide who meets who. But the valley walls keep reminding you that nothing here is fully settled. You look up and see hanging valleys, small side valleys perched high above the main river, leftover geometry from glaciation. In wet seasons, waterfalls drop out of them in long white threads. In dry seasons, the threads thin, but the stain of water remains on the rock, darkening it in vertical streaks. Those streaks are a map of seepage, a record of where water hides in fractures, then emerges when it feels like it. You cross a section where the rock face is fractured into blocks, as if it is considering falling but is not committed yet. Frost does that. Water seeps into cracks, freezes at night, expands, and pries the rock apart, one patient cycle at a time. Freeze and thaw is not dramatic, it is just repetitive, which is how most powerful processes work. 1,000 small actions instead of one big one. Above you, in the highest cirques and bowls, the snowfields begin. Even in warmer months, white holds on in shaded folds. The sun hits them and bounces light into your eyes, bright enough that you squint without realizing you are tired. And that is when you start noticing the presence of ice, not as a single glacier you go to visit, but as a set of conditions that shape everything. The air is colder up high, so snow can survive summer. If enough snow survives, it compacts. Layers press into layers. Air gets squeezed out. Snow becomes firn, a halfway state, grainy, dense, not quite ice yet, but clearly headed there. Give it time, and firn becomes glacial ice. Time and pressure, the planet's favorite recipe. You climb toward a glacier's lower tongue, and it looks like a sleeping animal stretched down the valley, dirty white, streaked with gray. It is not the clean ice people imagine. Real glaciers are messy. They pick up rocks. They carry debris. They grind their beds into powder. The surface is cracked with crevasses, long gashes that reveal blue depths where light is swallowed and scattered. The ice is slow, but it is not safe. It moves, it shifts, it opens, it closes. It is always adjusting its weight. If you stand still and listen, you might hear it. A faint pop, a distant groan, the sound of stress releasing inside frozen mass. It is not loud. It is intimate, like hearing a house settle at night, except the house is a river of ice. And the glacier is moving, not in a way you can watch like a river. It creeps. The whole thing deforms. The ice crystals sliding past each other. Sometimes it slides over the rock beneath, lubricated by meltwater. Sometimes it locks up and grips, depending on temperature and water. Congratulations, you are watching rock get planed down by frozen time. Glaciers carve differently than rivers. Rivers cut narrow and deep, focused into channels. Glaciers bulldoze in sand. They widen valleys. They smooth walls. They leave behind U-shapes and oversteepen sides. They also leave behind debris, moraines, ridges of unsorted rock dumped at the edges or at the end of a glacier. If you walk along one, it is a chaotic pile. Boulders, gravel, sand, all mixed together as if dumped from a careless truck. That is because the glacier is the truck. It picks up everything and drops it when it melts back. And it does melt back. Glaciers are not permanent. They advance in colder periods when snowfall exceeds melt. They retreat in warmer ones when melt wins. Many glaciers across the Himalayas and the plateau have been shrinking in recent decades. Less reliable snow, warmer temperatures, shifting precipitation patterns. Not a single cause, but a general trend of ice losing ground. When a glacier retreats, it can leave a lake behind, dammed by moraines or by remaining ice. These lakes can look calm, even charming, sitting in a raw basin of fresh rock. But they can be unstable if a moraine dam fails, or if ice collapses into the lake and sends a wave over the lip. The water can surge down valley in a sudden flood. A glacial lake outburst flood. It is a long name for a short disaster. Downstream, people build and farm where valleys widen, because that is where land is flatter and soils collect. Those are also the places a sudden flood prefers to occupy. The mountains do not plan for you. They just deliver consequences. You walk near meltwater emerging from under the ice, and it comes out like a secret. A narrow stream at first, shockingly cold, then quickly braiding into a wider channel. The water carries that pale ground rock, and it feels alive with motion, as if it has been waiting all winter to run. This meltwater is not just local. It is part of the plateau's slow generosity. In warm months, glacier and snowmelt can sustain flows when rain is scarce. In some regions, that seasonal pulse is crucial, but it is also a timing issue. If melt peaks earlier in the year, rivers swell when fewer people need water, and run lower later when demand rises. Water is not just about amount. It is about when. You keep following the flow down valley, and you feel the temperature rise in steps. Not smooth warming, but pockets. A sunny bend, a sheltered alcove, a section where wind no longer scours the skin. Plants respond immediately. More grasses, taller shrubs, occasional stands of trees in places that can hold soil and moisture. The valley becomes a thin ribbon of life against walls of stone. And the higher you look, the more you see the ice as storage, not just frozen water, but frozen years. Each snowfall trapped and compressed into layers. Some glaciers hold records of past atmospheres, tiny bubbles of ancient air sealed inside, a chilled archive stacked in thin sheets. If you ever wanted to touch deep time, you do not need a museum. You need a piece of ice that fell as snow before your grandparents were born. But ice does not keep secrets forever. It leaks them, slowly. And when the ice thins, the character of the landscape changes again. Meltwater spreads out, then loses strength. Channels break into gravelly braids. The valley floor widens into outwash plains, flat areas of sediment laid down by streams coming off glaciers. The ground here is restless. It looks stable until you watch how quickly a braided river rearranges itself. A channel that flowed yesterday can be dry today. Another channel can cut a new path in an afternoon. The river cannot decide because the sediment is loose and the slope is just steep enough to keep things moving. You step onto gravel bars, rounded stones clicking under your boots. Each stone is a small autobiography. It used to be angular, broken from a cliff or scraped from bedrock. Water tumbled it, knocked off corners, polished it into something almost friendly. Almost. The valley air is full of fine grit. It gets between your teeth. It coats your lips. It reminds you that erosion is not abstract. It is physical. It is in your mouth. And eventually, as you move away from the immediate influence of ice, the plateau's other personality returns. Dryness. It is not the dryness of a hot desert with shimmering heat. It is a high desert, calm, cool, thin, sun-bright, wind persistent. Evaporation happens quickly here. Moisture arrives and disappears like a thought you do not write down. You climb back up toward open country again, and the vegetation thins. The soil becomes more patchy. The ground turns to gravel plains, with stones packed like old bones. In some places, the surface is armored, a desert pavement, small rocks forming a protective layer over finer material. Wind removes the dust and sand, leaving behind the heavier pieces, like a picky eater leaving crusts. The wind is the main sculptor now. Not always strong, but always present. It sorts particles by size, lifting the finest ones into the air, nudging sand into ripples, leaving coarser gravel behind. On days with enough wind, dust haze can build, softening the horizon again. The plateau gives, then takes away the clean clarity it offered earlier. You watch dust devils spin across a flat, brief vortices that lift grit and vanish. Tiny weather events, private and indifferent. And the colors out here are gentle, even when the conditions are not. Tan and rust and pale gray, slate blue shadows, occasional dark rock outcrops, like islands in a sea of gravel. A distant lake flashes blue again, but smaller this time, a reminder that water can exist without abundance. A thin promise, a temporary arrangement, and in this high desert, shelter becomes a concept you can feel. A low hill breaks the wind. A boulder offers shade. A shallow dip holds a little more moisture and a little more plant life. You sit behind a rock, and the wind noise drops. Not to silence, but to a quieter register. The difference feels enormous, which tells you how much you have been listening to wind without acknowledging it. This is where you understand why things stay low, why shrubs hug the ground, why grasses grow in tight mats, why the landscape is full of small strategies, not big gestures. And yet, life does not disappear. It becomes discreet. You see it in tracks first. A line of hoofprints pressed into dust, droppings dried and pale, a path worn into a slope that looks too steep, until you remember that animals here have been climbing longer than you have been thinking. Yaks appear as dark shapes in the distance, moving slowly as if time is cheaper for them. Their bodies are built for this. Thick coats, wide chests, lungs and blood adapted to thin air. They do not fight the plateau. They belong to its tempo. They graze in places that look empty until you notice the green. Tiny blades, alpine sedges, plants that grow close and tough and do not bother with softness. A herd shifts and you hear a low grunt carried by wind, not loud, but present. The kind of sound that tells you the plateau is inhabited, even if it looks vacant. Birds ride the air above, using ridge-lift and thermals, like raptors circle without urgency. Smaller birds flicker between stones and shrubs, quick flashes of movement against muted ground. Some birds migrate through here using lakes as resting points. Some stay year-round, equipped for cold nights and bright days. Life has options, as long as it keeps them simple. And then there are the people. Not everywhere, not densely, but persistently. You find a tint like a dark punctuation mark on the plain. Smoke threads from a stovepipe, a few animals nearby. A fence made of stones and wire, doing its best impression of control. Human routines up here are not romantic. They are practical. Move with seasons, follow grazing, store fuel, build walls that block wind more than they block cold. At this altitude, boiling water takes less heat because air pressure is lower, which sounds convenient until you realize it makes cooking slower and more annoying. Rice can be stubborn. Tea takes patience. Everything is just a little more difficult, and that difficulty accumulates. Even fire behaves differently. Combustion can feel lazy in thin air. Flames can look hesitant. You may have come seeking serenity, and instead, you learn that geography changes the way soup happens. Congratulations! You have reached a place where making dinner is an endurance sport. You walk past a small settlement, and it feels carefully placed on a south-facing slope for sun, near a stream, but not too near, away from obvious avalanche paths, close to grazing land, but with some shelter from wind. These choices are not aesthetic. They are survival math, learned and relearned. And as evening approaches, the plateau's other famous feature begins to take over. The sky, without trees or tall buildings, the horizon is clean. The air can be dry enough to reduce haze. When night comes, stars arrive with an intensity that feels unfair to anywhere else you have lived. The Milky Way is not a faint suggestion. It is a band, textured and thick. You can see dark rifts where dust blocks distant starlight. You can see clusters that look like spilled salt. It is easy to think the sky is closer here. It is not, of course, but your mind does not care about facts when confronted with that much darkness filled with that much light. And under that sky, you remember the most important truth of the plateau. Everything here is the result of slow forces acting with absurd patience. The continents press, the crust thickens, the land rises. Rivers begin as marsh hesitations, then carve down. Lakes collect salt because they cannot leave. Mountains intercept weather and create shadows. Ice gathers in shaded bowls, then creeps downhill and sands valleys wider. Wind sorts dust like a bored clerk. Day after day, frost wedges rock apart without ever raising its voice. Gravity collects stones at the base of slopes and calls it a landform. And humans, loud in their own ears, become another small layer in the story. A trail, a wall, a camp, a seasonal movement across grassland, a pattern that lasts as long as it can. You stand still long enough to feel that the ground beneath you is not finished. The plateau is still being adjusted imperceptibly by forces that measure time in mountains. Somewhere deep below, the crust is warm and under pressure, thickened like stacked blankets. The roots of the mountains sink down into the mantle, buoyant in their own way, the planet's version of floating. Isostatic adjustment, there is the technical phrase, and it sounds like a gentle correction. In human terms, it is the ground trying to find balance after being loaded, lifted, and eroded. When ice melts, land can rebound. When mountains erode, the crust can rise a little, like a slow exhale. Even erosion can make mountains taller in a backwards way. Strip weight from the top, and the crust can respond by lifting. The planet is always compensating, always shifting the load. It is comforting in a bleak sort of way. The earth does not need your attention. It continues whether you notice or not, And because you are standing on a high place with few distractions, you can almost sense the planet's slow breathing. Uplift, erosion, deposition. Repeat. A gust of wind comes through, and prayer flags snap somewhere in the darkness, cloth complaining softly, a reminder that even culture here is designed to move with air. In the distance, you hear water again, not a roar this time, but a steady flow, a river continuing its long departure from the plateau. It will run for days and weeks and months, gathering other streams, crossing climates, passing cities that will never think about where it began. Up here at the source lands, you can still hear the quiet parts of the system. And as you keep walking through this vast, high world, you start to notice how the landscape changes when you step away from water. How quickly the ground turns to dust and stone. How the wind takes over as the main sculptor. How the plateau begins to resemble a calm, elevated desert that simply forgot to be warm. It forgot to be warm, but it never forgot to be busy. You walk out onto a stretch of gravel where the stones seem glued in place by habit. The surface is tight, almost varnished, like the land has been swept and sealed. This is not a road, not a courtyard. It is desert pavement, the plateau's way of armoring itself. Wind does the sorting here, and it is unreasonably good at it. Fine dust and sand get lifted and carried off, grain by grain, season by season. What remains are the heavier fragments, pebbles and small cobbles that cannot fly. They settle into a mosaic that protects the softer material below, like a lid on a jar. You think the wind is just air moving around, but up here, it is the main employee. It edits the landscape without ever asking permission. And when the lid gets disturbed, when animals cross, or vehicles cut tracks, or a storm arrives with extra enthusiasm, the dust beneath wakes up. It lifts in a thin veil, and suddenly you can see how the plateau exports itself, not as souvenirs, not as postcards, as airborne sediment, tiny mineral particles that leave the high country and drift far away, feeding distant soils, tinting sunsets, and quietly reminding other regions where the land has been scraped raw. In the driest basins, the wind can even make sound. Not a howl, not a scream, a low, steady hum that comes and goes. Sand grains skitter and bounce, a motion called saltation, which sounds like a polite dance. In human terms, it is sand being thrown at everything you own. Congratulations. You have reached a place where the weather exfoliates the planet. You notice the sky again because the dryness changes its color. It is a deeper blue than you are used to, not because the sky is different, but because there is less moisture and less haze to soften it. The sun feels closer and slightly rude. Your skin warms quickly. Then the moment you step into shade, the heat drops away like it never belonged to you. This is one of the plateau's quiet tricks. High deserts can roast and chill in the same hour. Because the air does not hold heat well, humidity is a blanket. And here the blanket is thin. In the distance, low hills rise like slow wrinkles in an old sheet. Their edges are rounded, not sharp, and their color shifts with the angle of light. Some slopes look almost purple at dusk, then flatten into gray by morning, as if the landscape is changing moods in its sleep. You start to see faint stripes on the ground, lines of slightly different color and texture. They run parallel, like comb marks. These are the small signatures of wind, places where finer grains accumulate and coarser grains lag behind. The patterns repeat because the wind and because nothing here interrupts it. Then, without warning, the plateau offers you a small mercy, a hollow in the land barely noticeable, but enough to change everything. The wind slows, and the air feels a fraction warmer. A few extra plants gather there, tight mats of green pressed close to soil, conserving moisture like it is a family secret. You crouch down, and you can see that the plants are not delicate. Their leaves are small and thick, or hairy, or waxy. They are built to resist drying and to survive cold nights. Up close, the plateau is not empty. It is simply economical. The soil smells faintly mineral, with a dry, clean edge. Not the rich, damp smell of lowlands, more like crushed stone and old sun. And if you look carefully, you find more life doing what it does best in harsh places, staying unnoticed. A burrow opening, small and round, at the edge of a tuft of grass. The resident is not eager to introduce itself. Small mammals here, like pikas and marmots in some regions, make a living by being quick and cautious. They clip vegetation, store it, and hide from the sky, because the sky comes with predators. You scan the open space above, and you see one, a raptor riding the air with an offensive level of ease, circling without flapping much. It is not just flying. It is reading the land's invisible movements, thermals, ridge lift, the atmosphere as a set of free escalators. The plateau makes it obvious that air is not empty. It is structured. It is moving in layers, and animals have learned to use those layers the way humans use roads. But wind is not the only sculptor out here. Cold gets its hands in everything. At night, temperatures drop hard. The ground releases heat quickly into clear sky, and whatever moisture exists in cracks and pores begins to freeze. Water expands when it becomes ice, which is a small miracle and a big problem. That expansion wedges rock apart, slowly turning cliffs into gravel, and gravel into sand. This is frost weathering, and it is not dramatic in the moment. You do not watch a mountain crumble like a movie scene. You watch small stones appear where there used to be fewer stones. You watch a slope gain a little more debris. You hear occasional clicks and pops in cold air, tiny adjustments as if the landscape is quietly chewing, and gravity, always patient, collects the results. Rock falls build talus slopes at the base of ridges. Fans of debris spread outward from gullies, shaped by occasional floods and debris flows. The fans look smooth from a distance, but when you walk on them, every step shifts, slides, and crunches. Your body understands what your mind tries to forget. Most of this terrain is not stable. It is merely resting. In places, you see scars where the ground slipped in the past, a landslide path, pale and raw, with the older surface still visible at the edges. The slide may have happened years ago or centuries ago. Up here, the land does not heal quickly. Vegetation returns slowly, so old wounds stay visible. A plateau can feel calm, but it is calm in the way a cold ocean is calm. There is always movement. It is simply not designed around your attention span. As you walk across another wide plain, you begin to sense a deeper dryness. The wind has less of a grassy smell now and more of a stony one. The surface underfoot turns patchier, with bare soil between plants. Then bare soil gives way to bare gravel, and gravel gives way to a kind of hard-packed dust that cracks into plates. The cracks make polygon shapes, like a broken tiled floor. This is what happens when wet ground dries and shrinks, then gets wet again, then dries again. Seasonal breathing of moisture, a quiet, repeating stress pattern. In colder parts of the plateau, similar patterns can form from freeze and thaw too. The ground sorts itself, pushing stones outward and upward through cycles, forming stone circles and stripes that look oddly deliberate, a kind of natural geometry built by physics, not design. You would call it patterned ground if you were writing a report. In human terms, it is the earth fidgeting in its sleep. And because the plateau is high and cold, even deserts here have their own relationship with ice. Some winters bring snow that does not last long on exposed plains because wind scours it away. But in sheltered spots, behind ridges, and in shaded gullies, snow lingers. It compacts slightly, and when the sun returns, it melts in thin sheets, feeding the ground with brief pulses of water. The melt does not always soak deep. In places where the subsurface stays frozen, water spreads sideways, turning flat areas into temporary wetlands. Then the sun and wind take it back. This constant switching between frozen and thawed, between wet and dry, makes the plateau's soils fragile. Step on a crust that took decades to form, and it breaks in a second. Biological soil crusts can exist in arid places, communities of tiny organisms that help bind the surface. They look like dark, rough patches, easy to mistake for simple dirt. But they matter. They hold the ground together. They reduce erosion. They make a thin skin of stability on a windy planet. Congratulations. You are walking on something alive that looks dead. The plateau's dryness also rewrites what water looks like when it does appear. A cloudburst can happen quickly, especially near mountains where air is forced upward. Rain can fall hard for a short time, then stop, as if someone turned it off. Because the ground is often compacted or frozen near the surface, water runs off rather than soaking in. It gathers into channels that are dry most of the year, then suddenly active. These are ephemeral streams, and they behave badly. They can flash and spread, carrying silt and gravel, carving shallow channels, then disappearing. A person can stand in a dry gully and think it is safe, until the weather upstream delivers a surprise. The plateau does not like to waste water. When it gets some, it moves it quickly, or stores it in ice, or loses it to the sky. And still, life remains. You see yaks again, closer now. Their coats are thick and shaggy, hanging in long strands that move gently in wind. They stand with a kind of calm that looks lazy, but is actually efficient. Moving too much burns energy. Energy is a valuable currency at high altitude. Their hooves are wide, good for soft ground and uneven terrain. Their bodies are built for cold. Their blood carries oxygen more effectively than yours does. Their lungs and hearts are designed for this thin air, like specialized machinery that does not complain. You watch them graze, tearing at short grasses, and you notice how they spread out. Not because they are antisocial, because the land cannot support a tight crowd in one spot for long. Overgrazing here is not a dramatic event. It is a slow shaving down of resilience until plants cannot recover and soil starts to loosen and wine begins to take more than it used to. The plateau is generous in space and stingy in productivity. It can feed herds, but only if pressure stays within limits that are easy to exceed. You see herders too, sometimes as small figures near tents, sometimes moving with animals along familiar routes. Their work is not picturesque. It is repetitive, seasonal, and tuned to weather in a way most modern lives are not. Summer grazing, winter shelter, choosing valleys that hold less wind, knowing which slopes melt earlier, knowing which streams dry up first, knowledge that is not stored in books, but in habits and in the memory of bad years. And there are bad years. A late winter storm can trap animals. A summer drought can thin grazing. An early cold snap can freeze water sources. Even when the land looks quiet, it can change the terms overnight. You pass a small cluster of stone walls, low and thick. They are not built to impress anyone. They are built to reduce wind, to corral animals, to create a pocket of slightly warmer air. You can feel the difference when you step behind them, as if someone turned down the volume of the world. In sheltered corners like this, you might find a few extra plants, maybe even a small garden in lower settlements, where people coax hardy crops through a short growing season. Barley is famous here because it can tolerate cold and altitude better than many grains. It grows fast, it ripens in limited warmth, and it becomes flour for sampa, a staple that makes sense in a place where resources are not abundant. Your modern brain wants variety. The plateau prefers reliability. And the plateau also prefers light, the intense kind. You look at a rock face and notice its surface is weathered differently on the side facing the sun. More cracking, more flaking, more bleaching. Solar radiation at high altitude is stronger because there is less atmosphere above to filter it. Sunburn arrives quicker. Snow blindness becomes a real risk when sunlight reflects off bright surfaces. Even in calm weather, the environment quietly asks for protective behavior. Sunglasses, covered skin, hydration, slow movement. But your body did not evolve for this place. You can adapt for a while, but you always remain a visitor. And then the night returns, and the plateau changes temperature like it is flipping a switch. The sky clears, and heat leaks upward. Stars sharpen. The Milky Way becomes textured again, like smoke that forgot how to move. The air feels thin and crisp in your throat. And with darkness comes a different kind of soundscape. Wind can calm, leaving pockets of near silence. Or it can rise, rattling fabric and making small stones tap against each other. Sometimes you hear a distant bark or call from an animal you cannot see. The sound travels far in open land, and you are reminded how exposed everything is. On clear nights, frost forms on the ground, even if the day was mild. A thin white lace on gravel, a delicate layer on plant leaves, glittering briefly at first light, then vanishing. This nightly freezing shapes the plateau as much as any river. Repetition is power, not excitement, just repetition. And somewhere in that repeating cycle, you begin to notice that the plateau is not just a high desert. It is a high desert that still carries the leftovers of ice. You see it in the valley shapes, the smoothed walls, The U forms. You see it in the moraines, those ridges of mixed debris that sit like abandoned earthworks. You see it in the outwash plains, built by meltwater that once had more ice to work with. The plateau is a museum where the exhibits are not behind glass, they are under your boots. As you keep moving, the land subtly shifts again. The gravel plains begin to show more grass, more continuous cover. The wind still runs the show, but now it shares the stage with grazing and with seasonal moisture. You are drifting into the plateau's grasslands, the broad, high pastures that look empty until you learn to read distance. At first, it is just texture, a faint fuzziness on the ground where earlier it was bare stone. Then the fuzz becomes a carpet in patches, stitched together by low plants that resist being uprooted. The green is not bright. It is the kind of green that has learned to be modest. In summer, these grasslands can briefly look almost lush in places, especially where meltwater and rain arrive. But the growing season is short. Plants rush their work, flower quickly, set seed, and retreat into roots and tough stems. Before cold returns, you realize that even the plateau's seasons are compressed. Summer is not a relaxed vacation. It is a frantic work shift. You walk through a shallow basin where water gathered earlier in the year. Now it is drying, and the soil is darker. Insects hum lightly near the remaining moisture. A few birds flick through, searching for food in the thin abundance. And when the wind catches again, you see how easily the land gives up its light materials. A faint dust trail lifts and slides away, barely noticeable, but constant. Multiply that by time, and you get real change. This is part of why the plateau matters far beyond itself. It is not only the source of rivers, it is also a source of sediments and dust that can travel huge distances. Dust from high Asia can reach across continents, depending on winds and seasons. It is strange to think about. A tiny grain of mineral lifted from this quiet plain could end up falling into the ocean, or onto a forest, or onto a city far away, becoming part of someone else's world without introductions. Geography is a long series of unrequested deliveries. And speaking of deliveries, you begin to notice that the plateau's life is connected by movement. Not fast highways, not crowded routes, but slow paths that repeat. Animal trails, human tracks, seasonal migration routes, places where people and herds move between summer and winter pasture, between wind-exposed plains and sheltered valleys, between high grazing and lower refuge. From above, these patterns look like faint stitching on fabric. From the ground, they are the difference between finding water and missing it. You follow one such trail for a while, and it leads you toward a slight rise. At the top, the land opens again, and you can see far. The view is wide enough to make you feel small, and that is the plateau's favorite gift. Not because it is trying to humble you, it just does not have any other setting. In the far distance, you can make out higher ridges where snow still clings, and you remember that ice here is not only in glaciers, it is also in the ground itself, in patches of permafrost that hold the plateau's hydrology in a strange grip. Permafrost is ground that stays frozen for at least 2 years in a row. Up here, that can happen because the air stays cold enough and because winter lasts long and night cooling is strong. When permafrost warms, even a little, the whole system shifts. The ground can slump. Small lakes can drain suddenly if frozen ground that acted like a seal begins to thaw. Or lakes can expand if thawing allows subsidence that creates new basins. The changes are often quiet at first. A small crack, a slight sag, a wet patch that was not wet before. But over time, the landscape can become more unstable. Not loud unstable, soft unstable. The kind that makes roads buckle, building foundations tilt, and slopes begin to creep. You can stand on what looks like solid ground, and it is, until it is not. And human infrastructure here has always had to negotiate that. Roads across the plateau are a modern kind of stubbornness. They cross high passes where engines lose power in thin air. They span areas where frost heave lifts and breaks pavement. They cut through permafrost zones where heat from dark asphalt can speed thawing. Some engineering tries to reduce this, raising roadbeds to allow air circulation, using light-colored surfaces to reflect sunlight, building in ways that acknowledge the ground is alive in its slow, frozen way. But the plateau has time, and it uses it. You keep walking across the grasslands, and you begin to notice more animals beyond yaks, small groups of wild ungulates in the distance, shapes that pause and watch you. In parts of the plateau, Tibetan antelope, called chiru, migrate across vast distances. Their movements are among the great quiet migrations of the world, happening across open land that looks empty to anyone not paying attention. They travel to calving grounds, timing their movement to seasons, to snow, to plant growth. Migration here is not a scenic choice. It is a survival algorithm written into muscle. There are wild asses too in some regions. Kyangs, sturdy and alert, adapted to cold and altitude. They stand against wind like they were built from the same materials as the hills. Predators follow this abundance, thinly spread. Wolves in some areas, snow leopards in higher rocky margins, where cliffs and broken terrain give them cover. You do not see one, because that is the point. The plateau is big enough for animals to remain mythical even when they are real. If you did see a snow leopard, it would be a brief ghost of motion, a pale shape on rock, a tail balancing, then nothing. Most of the time, you see only the evidence. Tracks in dust, scrapes, bones, cleaned by weather. The plateau does not hide death. It simply does not decorate it. And in this sparse world, even scavengers have a role that feels unusually visible. Ravens, for example, show up like dark punctuation against sky. They are clever, adaptable, and always watching. They can thrive where other animals struggle because they eat almost anything, and they learn quickly. You hear one call, a low croak carried by wind, and it feels like the land speaking in a voice that is not entirely friendly. Congratulations, you have met the plateau's unofficial narrator. As night comes again, you find yourself near a small camp. Not close enough to intrude, but close enough to notice details. A low tent, dark against pale ground. A few animals tethered. A stack of dried dung cakes, used for fuel because trees are rare and firewood is a fantasy. This is one of those practical realities that a postcard never includes. Up here, fuel is a problem. In some places, animal dung becomes the primary source, dried in the sun, stacked, carried, and burned. It smells earthy and sharp, and it keeps water boiling and hands warm. It is not romantic, it is effective. Inside such a tent, the air would be warmer, thicker with smoke and steam, scented with tea and fat and wool. Outside, the stars would keep doing what they do, indifferent and bright. You keep your distance and continue across the open land, letting the plateau remain what it is, a place of long horizons and short comforts. And as you move through this high desert calm, you notice how the land keeps inviting a certain kind of thought, not excitement, not urgency, more like perspective. Because up here, human time feels fragile. A storm can erase tracks overnight. Wind can fill in footprints with dust. Snow can cover a trail and make it vanish until spring. Even large structures look temporary when the sky is this big. You pass an area where stones are arranged in lines, low walls or boundaries, maybe to guide animals or mark space. The stones are weathered, lichen speckled in places where moisture allows it. They have been here longer than the last few seasons, maybe much longer. But even stone lines are not permanent in a landscape that freezes and thaws, that heaves and settles. Over decades, stones can shift. Over centuries, walls can slump. Over millennia, the ground itself can lift or tilt. Deep time is the plateau's true language. And when you think about deep time, you eventually circle back to the biggest fact of all. This whole region exists because of a collision that did not end. India is still moving north, still pressing into Asia. The rate is slow in human terms, but relentless in geological terms. The crust is still shortening and thickening. Parts of the plateau are still rising. At the same time, erosion is still lowering it. Rivers and wind and ice are shaving material off the top and moving it away. The plateau is being lifted and worn down at once, like a slow tug of war. In some places, you can see the result in river gorges at the margins, where water has cut deeply as the land rose beneath it. These are not gentle valleys. They are deep incisions, places where relief is extreme, where a short horizontal distance can mean a huge vertical drop. And those gorges are like escape routes for the plateau's water and sediment. The land rises, the rivers respond by cutting deeper, and the story continues. But out here in the interior, on the high plains, the changes feel quieter. The plateau's interior is where water hesitates, where lakes collect, where wind sorts dust, where grasses hold on, where life moves slowly because it has to. It is a kind of geography that rewards patience or forces it. You keep walking, and the ground under you changes again, becoming slightly softer in places. With more continuous vegetation, you can feel the difference in each step. Less crunch of gravel, more give of turf. And with that change comes more signs of life. Birdsong, sparse but present. A few insects, the occasional distant bark of a small mammal alarmed by your movement. The plateau is not silent. It simply does not waste sound. You look out across the grasslands and see the faint shimmer of a stream far away. A thin, reflective thread. Not a major river, not yet, but still a line of moisture, and therefore a line of meaning. Because Moisture is what decides where most things can be. You angle toward it, and as you get closer, you see the banks are slightly greener. Plants are tall or by a small but important margin. The soil is darker. The air smells a little less like rock and a little more like living matter. And then you see people again, not as a camp this time, but as movement. A small group traveling with animals, slowly crossing the land. They are not moving fast, they are moving correctly. Their pace matches the terrain, the altitude, the need to conserve energy. You watch them from a distance and you realize something quietly strange. In a place that looks empty, roots still exist, not marked on your maps, marked in memory and in repeated footsteps, and in the knowledge that certain valleys shelter snow less, or hold water longer, or offer a windbreak when the weather turns. The plateau is navigable if you know it. If you do not, it is an open maze, and that is part of why it has stayed sparsely populated in many areas. It is not that humans cannot live here. They can, and they do. But the land charges rent in the currency of effort, and it raises the price when you get careless. Even sleeping feels different at high altitude. Not a gentle drift, but a lighter rest, interrupted by cold, by wind, by the body's awareness that oxygen is thinner. You might wake and feel your heart working harder than usual, doing its own quiet labor. Your body does not fully relax here because the environment does not fully relax. Still, the plateau has its own calm, and it comes from consistency. Day follows night, wind follows sun, cold follows clear sky, and life follows the narrow window when growth is possible. You keep moving through the grasslands, and you begin to sense how the plateau acts like a giant ecological filter. Only certain strategies work here. Thick coats, efficient oxygen use, low-growing plants, seasonal migration, compact communities, fuel made from what is available, diets built around what can be produced. Everything else gets edited out, and in that editing, you can see elegance, not decorative elegance, functional elegance, the kind that looks simple because it has been refined by reality. As you walk, you pass through an area dotted with small ponds, shallow and dark. They are not lakes, not big enough, just meltwater and rain collecting in slight depressions. The margins are muddy, and hoof prints stamp the edges. These little waters can be crucial in dry times. They also attract birds which arrive in quick bursts, drink, and leave. Life here moves in errands, and some of these ponds are temporary. In a dry year, they vanish. In a wet year, they connect into longer wet corridors across the land. So the plateau's ecology is not fixed. It pulses with climate. And climate here is shaped by more than altitude. It is shaped by the plateau's sheer size. A high, broad surface heats and cools differently than a narrow mountain ridge. It interacts with the atmosphere like a giant platform, influencing wind patterns and moisture transport, not just locally but across Asia. This is why changes on the plateau matter downstream, not only because rivers begin here, because the plateau helps steer the seasonal breathing of the atmosphere, including monsoon behavior, storm tracks, and the distribution of moisture. It is a lot of responsibility for a piece of crust that did not ask to be lifted. But here it is, doing the job. You walk through a gentle rise, and at the top, The wind meets you again, steady and cool. The grasses bend in one direction, and you can see the wind's hand moving across the plain in broad strokes. In the far distance, you can just make out a line of higher ground, darker and more broken. The plateau's margins are never completely gone. Even in the interior, you can sense where the land will eventually tilt towards some river system, some basin, some destiny. Water divides exist out here, subtle and important. Cross one nearly invisible ridge, and a drop of meltwater will eventually end up in a different ocean, or in no ocean at all. That is the plateau's quiet power. It decides where water goes, and therefore where life concentrates far away. You take a few more hours of slow travel, and the land begins to change texture again. The grass becomes thinner, and the surface becomes more stony. The wind strengthens as you approach another open plain. This is the plateau cycling back into its dry face, as if reminding you not to get too comfortable. And as you keep moving through that demanding openness, you begin to notice how life here survives by becoming not just tough, but patient. Yaks do not rush. Birds use air currents instead of flapping. Plants grow low and conserve moisture. People move seasonally, staying flexible rather than stubborn. The plateau rewards adaptation and punishes insistence. It is the same lesson geology teaches, just delivered in grass and wind instead of stone and faults. You walk until the light begins to thin and the horizon turns softer. The sun sinks and shadows stretch long over the ground, filling small dips you did not notice before. And as the temperature drops again, you feel the plateau settling into its nightly pattern, wind easing in some places, rising in others, frost forming on exposed surfaces, stars sharpening overhead. You are still in the high desert calm, still in the wide grass and gravel world, and ahead of you, life continues to keep it simple, because anything else would be expensive. In the distance, you can hear the faint clink of stones under hooves and the low, steady sound of animals moving in the dark, guided by familiarity more than sight. And you follow that thread of living motion across the open land, letting the plateau's quiet, stubborn ecology come into clearer focus. The sound comes from animals you do not fully see yet, only sense as moving shapes in the dim. A herd does not need headlights out here. It needs memory and a nose that can find yesterday's grass under tonight's frost. You keep pace at a respectful distance, and the land keeps offering small lessons in how to stay alive without drama. Not heroism, not conquest, just good repetitive decisions. A yak is an impressive animal, mostly because it refuses to be impressed by anything. Thick hair, layered like an old coat you never throw away. A broad muzzle that can scrape food from ground that looks almost bare. And lungs that treat this thin air like an ordinary Tuesday. You, on the other hand, are still a guest. Your breath comes a little sharper when you climb a small rise. Your head feels the altitude when you stand too fast. The plateau is not punishing you. It is simply refusing to adjust itself for your convenience. Up close, you notice that the grassland is not one uniform carpet. It is a patchwork. Slightly wetter hollows hold denser sedges. Drier knolls grow short, tight bunches. In salty places, the plants thin and the soil gets pale and crusted. like it is trying to preserve itself. This is what ecology looks like when it is run by water scarcity and cold nights. Everything is organized around tiny differences in moisture and tiny differences in shelter from wind. A few birds keep working into the evening. You hear wing beats, quick and soft. You see silhouettes dropping into low vegetation, then vanishing. On the plateau, hiding is a serious career path. And then you come across something that looks like a careless scatter of stones until you notice the pattern. Small mounds, multiple openings. A colony, a place where the ground is busy under the surface. Pikas, in some parts of the plateau, build burrows and keep short grass clipped. Marmots do the same in other areas. Heavier bodies, deeper tunnels, long naps in winter that feel like a sensible response to the entire concept of February. These animals are not just residents. They are part of the land's maintenance crew. Their digging churns soil. Their clipping changes plant growth. Their tunnels shift how water infiltrates during melt. Predators rely on them. Birds of prey map their day around these little neighborhoods. Humans sometimes blame them for damaged pasture because it is comforting to have a small animal to point at. But pasture change is usually a group project. Grazing pressure, warming temperatures, shifting rainfall, road building, and yes, burrowing animals too. The plateau does not do single causes. It prefers layered explanations. You walk on, and you start to see more of the human layer again. Not crowded towns, not streetlights, just occasional infrastructure that looks like it was placed carefully, as if the builders were trying not to wake the land. A low wire fence, a simple bridge over a narrow stream, a line of poles carrying power, spaced far apart, crossing emptiness like a quiet argument that modern life can reach anywhere. And sometimes it does. The Qinghai-Tibet Railway is one of the clearest examples. It runs across permafrost country, across high passes, across open land where the horizon has nothing to interrupt it. It is a train line built through an environment that tries to undo roads for sport. Engineers had to treat the ground like a living thing, because it is. Permafrost is not just frozen dirt. It is frozen structure. Ice is the glue in the soil. Warm it, and the glue weakens. So in places, the railway bed is raised to let cold air pass under it. In some sections, there are crushed rock layers that help vent heat. There are even cooling techniques that rely on winter cold, moving heat out of the ground over seasonal cycles, like the landscape is being asked to breathe through a straw. It works, mostly, because human planning can be clever. But the plateau is patient and it collects interest on every mistake. You notice it in smaller ways too. A paved road that ripples slightly like a frozen wave. That can be frost heave, the ground expanding as ice lenses form in soil, lifting the surface unevenly. Then it settles again when thaw comes, never quite returning to where it started. Congratulations, you have built on a planet that changes shape in the night. Out here, life stays simple because complexity costs too much energy. That is true for animals and for people and even for plants. And you can feel that simplicity as you keep moving under the growing darkness. The sky remains loud with stars. The land remains quiet with cold. In the distance, the herd you followed spreads out near a low dip, a place that catches slightly warmer air. Animals know microclimates the way you know rooms in your house. the leeward side of a ridge, the hollow that traps less wind, the slope that catches morning sun first, you start to realize that the plateau is made of these small comforts. There is no single safe place. There are only places that are less bad for now. And since you are here, you begin noticing how the plateau holds two kinds of time at once. There is the fast time, night falling, frost forming, animals shifting their weight to conserve warmth, and there is the slow time, the land itself continuing its long adjustment. This is where the plateau starts whispering about deep geology again, even if you are trying to keep your thoughts on simpler things. Because the Tibetan Plateau is not just high, it is thick. The crust beneath you is unusually deep, like the earth stacked extra layers under this region, the way you might wear multiple blankets in winter. When India pushed into Asia, the crust shortened. It folded, it crumpled. In places, one slice of crust rode up and over another. If you could see in cross-section, it would look like shoved carpet, not smooth, not tidy, just compressed material with nowhere else to go but up. And deep below that, the mantle is not sitting still. It is warm, slow, and moving, like convection in thick soup. The crust and mantle interact, and that interaction helps determine how the plateau supports its own height. There is also the idea of a lower crust that can flow very slowly under pressure and heat, not flow like water, but flow like warm wax. This can redistribute mass under the plateau, helping maintain its broad uplift rather than collapsing into one narrow mountain chain. You do not need all the details to feel the result. You are walking on a region the planet built by pushing, thickening, and then continuing to push. And that pushing is not finished. Some faults here are locked, accumulating strain. Others creep in slow motion, releasing energy without a single dramatic snap. You do not notice creep on a normal day, but over years, it can shift walls, bend roads, and offset stream channels, giving the landscape a faint misalignment that looks like everything was nudged when no one was watching. In places, you can see old earthquake ruptures in the surface, a subtle step in the ground, a linear scarp crossing a plain, a line where grass grows differently because the soil and water changed when the earth moved. It is a strange thought standing in a quiet grassland, knowing the calm is partly a pause between releases, but calm is still real. The plateau teaches you that both things can be true. A place can be peaceful in the moment and dangerous in the long run. That is basically the Earth's whole personality. You continue moving and the terrain begins to shift towards something slightly more structured. The open plain gives way to low ridges and shallow valleys. Nothing dramatic, just enough relief to guide your path. And with that change, you feel the wind change too. It is not constant now. It arrives in pulses shaped by topography. You can almost hear the land controlling airflow, the way a hand controls water in a faucet. You pass a stream again, narrow and dark, and you notice the plants along it are different. A small ribbon of greener life, taller stems, maybe a few willows in a sheltered pocket, low and stubborn. Water does not just feed life here, it organizes it. Every creature knows where water sits, where it runs, and where it disappears. And the plateau has a lot of disappearing water, not because it is wasted, but because the sky takes it back quickly. Dry air can pull moisture from soil and leaves with relentless efficiency. Evaporation and transpiration together become evapotranspiration, which is a long word for a simple truth. The atmosphere is thirsty. So plants on the plateau behave like careful accountants. They open their pores when they can afford to, and they close them when they cannot. They grow low to avoid wind. They build waxy surfaces and tiny hairs, little tricks to hold moisture near the leaf. Even the timing of flowering can be an emergency decision. When warmth arrives, plants rush to reproduce. Pollinators, when they exist here, rush too. Insects have short seasons. Birds time nesting around the brief peak of food. It is not frantic in the way a city is frantic. It is seasonal urgency, quiet but real. You walk past a patch of ground that looks darker and slightly bumpy, like burned toast spread thin. This can be biological soil crust, a community of organisms that binds soil together. Cyanobacteria, lichens, mosses, tiny life forms that stabilize the surface, reduce erosion, and help retain moisture. They grow slowly. They break quickly. A single tire track can crush years of growth. A careless shortcut can turn stable crust into loose dust that the next wind will carry away. The plateau does not get angry about this. It just responds. So when you see braided tracks crossing a plain, you are seeing more than convenience. You are seeing the land being asked to heal faster than it wants to. And healing is slow up here. Cold slows decomposition. Dryness slows plant regrowth. Thin soils take time to build. That is why scars last. That is why an old landslide line can remain pale for decades. That is why abandoned tracks can still be visible long after the reason for them is gone. The plateau is a place where the past does not leave quickly. You keep moving, and the ridges around you begin to sharpen slightly. You are drifting toward the margins again, toward the places where the plateau starts to break into mountain and valley, where the map gets complicated. And that means gravity is about to become more ambitious. Even before you see steep slopes, you see the evidence of their work. Coarser sediment, larger stones in stream beds, channels that look more incised. The water here is not just wandering, it is preparing to drop because the plateau is high and the world around it is lower. That difference is potential energy stored in elevation. Rivers eventually get to spin that energy, cutting down, carrying sediment away, carving deep corridors at the edges. Some of the deepest gorges on Earth exist along the plateau's margins. In the greater region, rivers like the Yarlung Tsangpo, which becomes the Brahmaputra downstream, cut through rising terrain with stubborn persistence. It flows along the plateau, then turns sharply and dives into a gorge, dropping fast toward humid lowlands. It is one of those geographic facts that sounds like a mistake. A major river slicing through tall mountains instead of being blocked by them. The reason is timing and the weird patience of rivers. A river can establish its course before mountains fully rise. Then, as uplift occurs, the river keeps cutting down, maintaining its path by eroding as fast as the land rises. This is called antecedent drainage, which is the technical phrase for a river refusing to reroute. It is like drawing a line on a piece of paper, then slowly crumpling the paper upward while the line stays in the same place by cutting deeper into the folds. The paper becomes mountains, and the line becomes a gorge. That is not the only way gorges form. but it is one of the most satisfying because it means the river wins, not through strength, but through persistence. You can feel that persistence in the sound of water as you approach steeper terrain again. The stream you followed grows louder, not because it is bigger, but because it has more gradient, more drop, more urgency. And then you see the slope ahead, and the plateau's calm face starts to crack into the kind of landscape that forces you to pay attention. The ground begins to angle down. Loose stones appear more often, the grass thins, and the soil looks shallower. This is where plants have a harder time holding on, and where gravity starts collecting what the frost has loosened. You step carefully because the surface is a mix of firm ground and unstable scree. A harmless-looking patch of gravel can slide underfoot, shifting like it has been waiting for an excuse. This is also where you start to see the signature of mass wasting, the general term for rock and soil moving downhill. It includes rockfalls, landslides, debris flows, and the slow creep of soil that shifts millimeter by millimeter. The plateau's edge is a factory for this movement. Uplift makes slopes steep, rivers cut down, making valley walls taller and less stable. Freeze-thaw breaks rock. Rainstorms trigger failures. Earthquakes shake loose what was already thinking about falling. If you ever wondered why mountain roads often have fresh rock on them, this is why. The mountains are constantly remodeling, and the debris has to go somewhere. Gravity is the delivery service, and it does not do refunds. You come to a place where an old landslide has left a hummocky surface, uneven lumps, and sagging depressions. The vegetation is patchy. Some areas regrew, some are still raw. The slide moved long ago, but the texture remains, like a scar you can feel with your feet. In a valley below, you can see a fan-shaped deposit spreading out where a steep gully meets flatter ground. An alluvial fan. It forms when a fast, sediment-loaded flow exits a narrow channel and loses energy, dropping its load in a wide spread. These fans look gentle from a distance, like smooth slopes where you might build a house, but they are built by occasional violence, flash floods and debris flows that come roaring out of the gully when conditions align. Water plus loose sediment plus gravity equals a moving slurry that can carry boulders like they are groceries. You do not need to see one to respect it. The shape is already the story. The fan is a record of repeated events, each one leaving another layer of gravel and sand. Congratulations, you have found a landform made of bad timing. People still build near fans sometimes because flat land is rare in mountains, and because the dangerous flows are rare enough to feel hypothetical. The mountain patiently waits for someone to forget. You continue along the slope and the air changes. It is slightly thicker, slightly warmer, the way it does when you lose elevation. The smell of vegetation increases in little pockets, a hint of resin if you pass near scattered conifers, a darker soil smell in shaded areas. And you realize again how fast climate changes with height here. The plateau above can be cold and dry. The valley below can hold moisture, trees, and a longer growing season. It is like walking down through invisible layers of the atmosphere. In the deepest valleys along the margins, you can even find places that feel almost subtropical compared to the high plains above. Dense forests, broad leaves, humid air, rivers loud and brown with sediment. This is vertical geography, not just distance across a map, but stacked worlds. And that stacking matters for life. It creates biodiversity zones. It creates migration corridors. It creates places where people can farm in sheltered warmth, while herders graze animals higher up in summer. It also creates weather traps. Cold air can drain into valleys at night, pooling like water. Fog can form in the morning, then burn off late. In winter, inversions can trap cold air below, while higher slopes stay sunnier and warmer. If you have ever stood in a valley and looked up at bright sunlight on ridges while you shiver in shade, you have met this phenomenon. Mountains do not just make weather, they store it. As you traverse along a ridgeline, the wind rises again, pushing from the side. You feel it in your clothing, in the way it steals heat from exposed skin. Wind chill is not a separate temperature. It is just your body losing warmth faster. And you can see the winds work in the trees too, where they exist. Low, bent shapes, branches thicker on one side, growth shaped by persistent direction. Everything here leans into reality. You pass a small stand of shrubs clinging to a slope, and you notice how their roots grip soil and rock. Roots are stabilizers. When vegetation is removed, slopes can fail more easily. That is why overgrazing and deforestation in lower areas can increase landslide risk. Up on the plateau, trees are rare, but in valleys, they matter. Their absence or presence changes the behavior of water. It changes runoff. It changes erosion. Geography is never just one factor. It is always a bundle. You follow a narrowing valley, and the stream becomes louder, more confined. You see boulders in the channel, rounded but still massive, too large to move most of the year. They wait for flood events, when the river swells and finally has enough energy to shove them forward. Rivers carry sediment in different ways. Fine silt stays suspended, making water cloudy. Sand can hop along the bottom in saltation, bumping and bouncing. Gravel rolls and slides. Big boulders mostly stay put, except during rare high flows. So when you see boulders moved far downstream, you are seeing evidence of extreme events: a flood, a glacial outburst, a landslide dam breaking. The quiet stream you step over today might become a different creature during a storm. And storms here can be sudden, especially near mountains. Air rises over ridges, cools, and drops its moisture. A cloud builds quickly, then unloads in a narrow area. The rest of the sky stays clear, like nothing happened. You can stand in sunlight and watch rain falling in a gray curtain a few miles away. That is the plateau and its edges, always making local exceptions. As you continue, the valley widens slightly, then narrows again, and you see a slope across from you that looks strangely smooth and bare, like a scraped wall, a landslide scar. The fresh rock is paler, less weathered. The debris below is piled in a rough tongue. If the slide happened recently, you might see broken trees, snapped like twigs. If it happened long ago, you might see regrowth, thin and patchy, struggling uphill. Sometimes slides dam rivers, creating temporary lakes. The water backs up, calm and innocent. Then the dam fails because it is made of loose debris, and the lake drains in a rush, carving and flooding downstream. These are natural systems, and they do not do gradual when a dam gives way. The plateau feeds these systems with sediment. Uplift supplies fresh rock. Frost breaks it down. Rivers move it. Valleys store it until they cannot. And humans living in the narrow flat spaces near rivers are simply placed in the path of these cycles. You keep walking, and the sound of water becomes steady enough to blend into the background. It turns into a kind of moving silence, a constant, low rush. That is when you notice another constant at the margins of the plateau. Human attempts to manage the river, a small embankment, a line of rocks placed to protect a bank, a diversion channel, sometimes a larger dam where the valley geometry allows it. Hydropower is an obvious temptation in high relief terrain. Water dropping from high elevation has energy. You can turn that drop into electricity. And in regions with growing demand, dams multiply. But dams in mountain valleys come with their own list of concerns. Sedimentation, for one. Rivers here carry heavy loads of silt and gravel. Reservoirs trap that sediment, slowly filling in. Downstream, less sediment can mean riverbeds erode more, or deltas shrink, changing habitats and stability. Then there is the hazard issue. A dam downstream of unstable slopes is vulnerable to landslide waves. A dam downstream of glacial lakes is vulnerable to outburst floods. It is not that it cannot be done. It can. It is that the landscape does not stop being active just because humans poured concrete. You begin to feel tired, not in a dramatic way, but in the honest way. Altitude and cold and walking do their work. And the plateau's edge offers you a small flattening, a bench of land where the slope eases. You step onto it and feel the difference immediately. Your footing becomes easier. The wind changes. The temperature shifts slightly. This bench exists because of geology. A harder rock layer resisting erosion, forming a step. Or an old river terrace, a former floodplain left hanging above the modern river after the channel cut down. Terraces are like historical records. They tell you the river used to flow higher. Then it incised, leaving the old surface stranded. Why does a river incise more deeply? Often because the land is rising, or because climate changed, altering sediment supply and water volume, or because base level changed downstream. On the plateau's margins, uplift is always part of the story. As the land rises, rivers cut down to keep up. That downcutting can leave terraces and stair steps, a layered archive of river positions over time. You can stand on a terrace and look down at the river now, and imagine earlier water flowing where you stand. It is a quiet way to feel deep time without needing to climb a mountain. And as you rest on this flatter ground, you look back, upslope, toward the plateau interior, and you feel the scale again. That high, broad world you crossed is still up there, holding cold air and headwaters and salt lakes. It feels distant now, even if it is not far in miles. Distance in mountains is measured in effort, not maps. You turn your attention forward again, and you see the valley continuing, bending around a ridge. The river disappears briefly behind rock, then reappears, louder. And with that bend comes another subtle shift. The rock walls look different. Layers become more visible, tilted beds with varying colors, pale tan, dark gray, rusty red. These colors come from different depositional histories. Sedimentary rocks formed in ancient basins, compressed over time, then lifted and folded. Some layers might have been river deposits, others lake beds, others marine sediments from when an ocean existed where these mountains now stand. That ocean, the Tethys, is the reason you can find marine fossils high in the Himalayas, shells and microfossils embedded in limestone that now sits at altitudes where breathing feels like work. It is one of the planet's best jokes. Sea life remains lifted into the sky by continental impatience. You do not need to find a fossil tonight. You can just know it is possible, and let that be enough. The valley air grows cooler again as night deepens. The river keeps moving. The stars remain sharp overhead, at least where the valley opens enough to see them. And you keep going, following the geography the way water follows gravity. The path you take is not a trail in the official sense. It is a tendency. A route chosen because it avoids the loosest slopes and stays near water, without being in its way. This is how travel often works in rugged terrain. You do not pick the shortest line. You pick the line that will not punish you. And as you move, you begin to notice that even here, on the margins, the plateau's dryness still matters. The air is not humid. It does not cling to you. It stays crisp. Even near the river, moisture feels contained, as if it is not allowed to spread. That restraint is partly because of temperature. Cold air holds less water vapor. It is partly because of wind, always mixing and drying. And it is partly because the plateau's influence remains, a high cold mass nearby, shaping regional climate, but drop far enough, and the story changes. You will eventually reach zones where monsoon moisture dominates, where forests thicken, and where the river becomes a different color and mood. For now, you are in the in-between, a seam landscape, a place where the roof of the world starts giving up its height. One valley at a time, you pass a slope with scattered boulders that look placed, but they are not placed. They are left behind. Glacial erratics, rocks carried by ice and dropped when the glacier retreated. Sometimes they sit alone in unlikely spots, like a piece from a different puzzle. Their presence tells you ice used to reach here, or at least ice influenced this valley. Glaciers have been shrinking and expanding for thousands of years, responding to climate swings. During colder periods, they advanced, carving and transporting. During warmer periods, they retreated, leaving moraines and outwash and erratics. Right now, in recent decades, the trend in many parts of the region has been retreat, with complex local variation. Some glaciers lose mass quickly. Some are more stable. Some surge unpredictably, advancing rapidly for a time due to internal dynamics, then slowing again. A surging glacier is a reminder that even ice has moods. It can flow faster for a period, pushing forward like it suddenly remembered somewhere it needed to be. Downstream, people notice, because rivers change, sediment increases, and hazards shift. You walk on, and the night feels steady, the kind of steady that makes hours blur. You hear a distant rumble that is not thunder, it is rockfall. Somewhere on a high slope, a small collapse happened. Stones bouncing and rolling, sound echoing off valley walls, then fading. It is not a crisis. It is maintenance. The mountains are always shedding weight. And you are still moving through life that keeps it simple, because this land makes complicated living too expensive. You see another small camp in the distance, perhaps seasonal, a low structure, maybe stone, maybe fabric. A faint glow, then darkness again as someone shields a flame. People here often live in a rhythm that follows pasture and weather, and that rhythm has been shaped by the plateau for a very long time. It is a system built around mobility, because staying fixed in one spot can be risky when resources shift. Mobility also spreads grazing pressure. It allows pastures time to recover. It is not always easy. It is not always possible with modern boundaries and development, but the logic remains. The plateau is big, but usable land is still limited by water and temperature. So people adapt by moving rather than forcing one location to provide everything. And the animals adapt by doing what they do best: enduring. You keep moving and the valley begins to widen again. Just slightly, the river braids in places, splitting around gravel bars. You can hear multiple channels, each with its own pitch, like a chord. Braided rivers happen when sediment supply is high and the channel slope is relatively steep. The river cannot carry all its material in one channel, so it deposits bars, splits, rejoins, and reshuffles. It looks messy, but it is a stable pattern for an unstable environment. And that braided pattern is another reminder of the plateau's ongoing gift and problem. It produces sediment constantly through uplift and frost and gravity. The river's job is to remove it. Downstream, that sediment becomes fertile soil in floodplains and deltas. Up here, it is mostly an obstacle underfoot. Geography is unfair like that. The benefits often appear far away from the costs. You follow the river until the sound becomes hypnotic, and you notice the valley floor is dotted with low shrubs again. More than before, the air feels marginally warmer. You have dropped enough elevation for small differences to matter. This is a good place to notice how the plateau's influence spreads beyond its boundaries. The Tibetan Plateau affects winds and storms, but it also affects river timing, sediment loads, and even atmospheric circulation patterns that reach far beyond this valley. In summer, the plateau can act like a heat source in the atmosphere, warming air and helping drive circulation. In winter, it can act like a cold, high surface, strengthening high-pressure systems. These seasonal shifts influence the monsoon, and the monsoon influences billions of lives in South and East Asia. So this quiet place, where you can hear stones clicking in a river, is connected to distant rice fields and coastal cities and ports. The connection is not emotional. It is physical. It is air and water moving on a rotating planet. You keep walking, and the river bends again, and the valley begins to narrow into a more pronounced corridor. The walls rise steeper. The stars become a thinner strip overhead. This is the kind of place where you can feel enclosed without any roof. Rock walls create their own sense of night, and here, the wind behaves differently. It funnels through the corridor, sometimes intensifying, sometimes dropping to stillness. You feel it as alternating pressure on your face, like the valley is breathing. If you listen closely, you can hear the difference between wind in open plain and wind in a confined valley. In open plain, it is a steady brush. Here, it has eddies, pulses, sudden hushes. You pass a cliff face where water seeps out in a thin line. Even in darkness, it is not a stream, just seepage, emerging from a fracture in rock. The water has been stored in porous layers or in cracks, and gravity is slowly pulling it out. Springs like this can be reliable. Even when surface flows dry up, they are part of the hidden hydrology, groundwater moving through rock. In many mountain regions, springs are crucial for human settlement. A village exists where water is reliable, not where the view is nice. You cup a little water in your hand, and it is cold enough to sting. It tastes like rock, clean and sharp. And you keep going. The land continues its long descent from the roof of the world, but it does not do it quickly. It does it in steps, in benches and slopes and gorges. And you are still inside the same overall lesson. The planet does not rush even when it drops thousands of feet in a short horizontal distance. The change is dramatic in your body, but in geology, it is still part of a slow adjustment. Rivers cut down over thousands and millions of years. Uplift continues. Erosion continues. Ice comes and goes. Vegetation shifts with climate. People adapt, migrate, build, abandon, and the valley you are walking through is a kind of conveyor belt, carrying water and sediment away from the plateau, delivering it to lower lands, grain by grain. You walk until the night feels settled, and the sound of the river becomes the most constant thing in your world. Ahead, the corridor turns again, and the ground begins to tilt a little more steeply